We're currently doing a preaching series on looking at the different issues that there are in St. John and in our community. For those of you who may be visiting us, we do have quite a high rate of poverty in St. John, and one of the things that you may notice if you go to some of the more distant places in our community is some tents that have cropped up. And so we are dealing with issues of homelessness and addiction, among a lot of other things. One of the things that comes up often when we discuss these issues is, well, what do we do about them? How do we fix the problems in our community? And I think that's something that a lot of communities face when we ask, how do we fix the issues around us? And the truth is that there's never one answer. There's never a silver bullet that's going to make all the problems of poverty and their associated needs go away. Last week, Terrence spoke about the issues of generational poverty and how that affects our community. But in that message, there's also this message of hope that the sins of the father are not visited upon their sons and children, and that God sees us as fresh new people without the baggage of what we've gone through. And this morning, I'd like to add a little bit onto what Terrence spoke about last week. But I also want to talk, just address as part of this, some of the issues that we have specifically tied to children. This week we had a day of remembrance on Friday for kids, Aboriginal kids who've been part of the, who've grown up with some of the consequences of the residential school system in Canada, which is a school system that took children away from their families and took their languages away from them and forced them to try to assimilate into a culture that was foreign to them. And so there's some huge tragedies that happened when we did that as a country. And when we think about those abuses, when we think about some of the abuses we hear about in the church even, when we hear of people in authority who have caused children to suffer, and one of the things that we ask and that we rightfully should ask in those instances is, where is God in all of this? What does God have to say about these things? And I do believe that this morning's gospel passage from Matthew answers that question. When Jesus says, bring the children to me, welcome the children, but also attached to that message of welcome for children is a warning that anyone who should cause a little one to stumble, better is it for him to have a millstone hung around his neck and be thrown into the sea. I mean, that's some of the harshest words we hear Jesus ever say. And they're directed exactly at these situations of anyone who might harm children. Now, in most churches, if you walk in, you'll see a stained glass window with Jesus welcoming children. We have one, it's the Emerson window just here, where it just so happens when we did the renovations to the church that became the Sunday school room. And that wasn't planned in the designs, but we do have this window. And it says, suffer the little children to come unto me. It's from the Old King James translation of this passage we read this morning. And it is that important reminder of the value that children have of being around us, of being in a faith community, and the value that Jesus places on children. Of course, in the time of Jesus, children weren't really that important. It was, it's not really like our culture. I think we value and spoil our kids a bit more than back then. It was just waiting for them to be able to have enough skills to contribute to the life of the family. And we clearly see in this morning's passage how the children that were coming up to Jesus and kind of, keeping the adults distracted and people, whenever you have kids coming up in swarms around a person, it's hard to pay attention. My daughter's been known to do circles around me while I talk, and it's very hard for people to pay attention to what I'm actually saying in those instances. So the disciples are saying, oh, let's get these kids out of here, let's move them away, so that the adults can hear what Jesus has to say. And Jesus says, no, let the kids stay. In fact, not only let them stay, but if you want to be the greatest in the kingdom of heaven, look to them, because here's your example of how that's going to happen. And then Jesus goes on to say the warning I already talked about. And in a way, this focus on children and the warning that Jesus gives is about 2,000 years ahead of his time. We now know a lot more about the development of kids and what's going on in their brains and how things affect them. And I think it's an important reminder to us to think about what's going on in children's lives and as they grow in our midst, not just our own kids, but the kids that we interact with. What's going on with them and how can we contribute to their lives being healthy? And what role do we have to play in that? So a couple of years ago, I received training in ACEs. ACEs is Adverse Childhood Experiences. It's a fairly well-known study from the 90s that actually has repercussions now into a lot of the ways that we view the issues that are in our community, because one of the things we talk about is what are some of the root causes. And we find that a lot of root causes to the issues in our community actually stem from childhood trauma and stress. I remember one time earlier on in our ministry here in the city, I met a street worker and we started talking, and I eventually developed enough of trusting relationship with her that I could ask her, how did you end up in this line of work? And she said, well, you know, I have the typical story, sexually abused as a kid, and then she went on to list a number of horrible events in her life. And I think that was just such a moment of recognition for me, because so many women in our community who are in street work, who are struggling, have that beginning in life, what she called a typical story of being sexually abused as a child. And I just thought right then, and I said to her, I don't know what my life would be like if that was my experience. I don't know where I would be. And I think a lot of us might feel that way too. If that were to happen to us, where would we be? And in fact, when I speak to the other nonprofits in this city about the women who access their services, many of them will say that up to 95 or even 99 of the women they deal with have this as their typical story. And so how can we as a society allow that to be a typical story for anyone is just beyond me. And I think, and it's not just women, you know, I think the statistics on men are much harder to gather up, but when I speak to the other nonprofits about the statistics regarding men, that figure hovers around 40 or 50% of men who have that as their typical experience. And so when you start out life like that, how then can you move forward? How can you go on? And we do have amazing stories of people who have built resilience and who've crafted their lives and been able to get over things and have, you know, be able to be productive in society. But it's such a challenge when that's the start. And so the ACEs is a way of looking at what are the adverse childhood experiences that someone might have growing up, and how do those experiences affect them later in life. And it's not just a tale of woe. It's also then, if we know that there's these adverse childhood experiences, then what kind of resilience can we build in as well? How can we shift that story? How can we change some of those figures and numbers? So in the 1980s, Dr. Anda and Dr. Vincent Folletti were working on trying to figure out some of the root causes to the issues in society, specifically relating to health. And their research eventually led them to create this ACE study in the 90s. And what they did is they took 17,000 people who had fairly steady lives, who had access to good health insurance, and who were living in sunny California. And they studied these 17,000 people. In fact, they're still being studied to this day. And they looked at the health factors of these people, and they looked at some of the adverse experiences that they might have had growing up. And what they ended up finding with scientific evidence is that adversity early in life increases physical, mental, and behavior problems later in life. In other words, if we want to address our current social issues, we need to look at childhood experiences. And a lot of that has to do with brain development, but also how the windows of opportunity at certain ages can be used to build resilience. So I took a training course directly from Dr. Anda and his team. So I am going to be talking a little bit about ACEs. And just to let you know, this is usually an hour and a half or a half day program, and I've condensed it a lot. So it's not the full information, and you'll thank me for that later, I'm sure. But if you want to know more, there's a lot of information about ACEs, and we can always talk more about that. Now, one of the things that the study discovered is that humans are only meant to be under stress for about 20 minutes at a time. It's long enough to fight or hide, or I would also say freeze until the threat leaves. So experiences that causes stress chemicals to continuously be produced, so for example, child abuse, neglect, or even being in a war zone, these have a big impact then on development and on brain development. They cause our bodies to prepare for a tough life, in a dangerous world. And stress hormones exert influence then on cells and on chemicals and on wiring. They sculpt the brain to be wired for certain characteristics. And it ends up that some of the side effects of this might be that someone who's been exposed to these adverse childhood experiences and whose brain has developed and adapted to these experiences, they might be quick to anger, maybe a bit edgy, maybe impulsive, maybe hypervigilant. They might be also withdrawn or disassociated or numb. And for example, if someone has a traumatic stress from conception to toddler years, they'll likely have a higher baseline of stress hormone in their bodies. And as a result, they might have a short fuse, they might be self-focused, they might have a difficult time shifting gears or even dealing with emotions and problem solving. And really this makes sense because if their bodies and brains are reacting and adapting to their experience, if there's more danger just around the corner, being focused on others and thinking through options isn't going to contribute to survival. Readiness for the next danger is what they're being prepared for. But the downside is that when stress hormones stick around for a long time, they're toxic to brain cells. And this makes it difficult for brain cells to develop neural networks and can even cause brain cells to die off. It's what we call toxic stress. On the other hand, if someone has grown up in, let's say, a more benevolent world that doesn't involve the same levels of toxic stress, their response to this environment will lead to different behaviors and characteristics. They might be more easygoing, helpful, free from traumatic stress, and chances are the people growing up on this path may develop a brain with cells and wiring and chemistry for being focused, flexible, and relationship-orientated. Now, usually in our society, we would view people that have more toxic stress or who've grown up in that environment or people whose behavior reflects that. We would say that they're maladaptive and that those who've grown up with less stress in their lives or less toxic stress, we might say that they're more adaptive. But that's not true. Both brains are adapting to their environment and their experience and doing what they need to survive in their worlds. Dr. Martin Feicher of Harvard University said that it's when our biology collides with societal expectations, that's when we run into trouble. In other words, if you put a person from the benevolent world into the chaotic and turbulent environment of, let's say, riot control, that person's going to struggle unless they have very specific training. In the same way, if a child from a more stressful environment starts school and is asked to sit and pay attention, to share and cooperate, there can be a painful disconnect that's hard on everyone. The child has to be trained just as the person from the benevolent world may have to be trained in some circumstances. So a large part of looking at adverse childhood experiences is not just identifying what your ACEs might be, what your adverse childhood experiences might be, or even determining a score for that. The main point is for a broader society to learn how to change the question. When we have people who are exhibiting behaviors that maybe we're struggling with, or that there's a disconnect or causing conflict, we might want to change the question after of asking, what's wrong with you, to ask, what happened to you? I remember I directed an after-school program for a while, and two of the kids started fighting, And one of the parents came down, and the first thing she did was she looked at the kid who had instigated it, and she shouted at him, "What's wrong with you? What's your problem?" And that kind of question is often an instinct for us. But what this study is asking us to change is to think about the background story to that child and their behavior. I mean, it could be they're just acting out, but sometimes there is that story, and to be more understanding of the various behaviors around us. If we know that toxic stress affects behavior, then it helps us not only to understand someone's behavior, but also to understand what they've been through and how it's shaped who they are. So what exactly are the adverse childhood experiences? Now, mind you, this study was done in the 90s, so some of it may be a little bit dated, and you might be able to adjust it somewhat today. We might, instead of 10 adverse childhood experiences, now be able to come up with 15 or 20. So the experiences are if someone in the house has a substance abuse issue, if parents are separated or divorced, if someone in the house has a mental illness. It says battered mothers, but that could be battered fathers as well. If someone in the house is either doing a criminal behavior or has gone to jail, emotional neglect, physical neglect, emotional abuse, physical abuse, sexual abuse. So those are the 10 ACEs. Now, if you want to calculate your ACE score, you would take any of those experiences and you would count how many of them have happened in your life before you were 18. And it doesn't matter if something has happened multiple times or just once, it counts as a score of 1. So if someone was neglected as a child, that's a score of 1. If someone had a family member in their household with a mental illness, you add another 1. And the ACE score matters because it shows that the higher the ACE score that someone has, the more likely someone will have attributable problems such as disease, mental health issues, substance abuse issues, violence, workplace problems, and so on. In fact, they found that if someone has 4 or more as an ACE score, there's a jump in the likelihood of seeing these problems and even more. When I took this training, I was in a room of 30 professionals, and I was surprised to see how many people in the room had higher ACE scores. I mean, we were people that were working decent jobs, that were taking this training as part of our workplace development. And there's some people that even had maximum of 10. They had experienced every single one of those things in the ACEs scores. And that's exactly what this study has proved. ACEs don't discriminate based on income or background, and they're also surprisingly common. I think we all were surprised when we started talking about our ACE scores and what they were. And in the original study from the 90s, 3/4 of the people had scores of at least 1. And as I said, that was doing, with people who were living in sunny California, doing pretty good, having good lives. And so if you look at this list and you start calculating your ACE score, remember that it's not a diagnosis. And the ACE score is meant for us to help to understand our own behaviors and responses. And it's also a way of trying to make things better. For example, if I know that the household I grew up in had some dysfunction, and if I know my ACE score is, let's say, a 5, then I'm going to do everything that I can to make sure that my children don't have a high ACE score. Or, for example, if we are raising kids and we know that because of certain circumstances, some that might be completely beyond our control, our children might have an ACE score of 1 or 2. Well, how do we keep that from rising and going up? And I think we can spend a lot of time talking about what can go wrong. It's important to minimize ACE scores and also, I think, build resilience. Because the ACE study shows that there are times in childhood and brain development that are particularly sensitive to experiences, which is why adverse experiences happen in these stages and why they can affect their whole lives. It also means that these childhood times are windows of opportunity for building resilience. And so what are some of the things that we can do to build that resilience, to offset the issues that might be faced through ACEs? And some of these things are encouraging skills and abilities to teach our kids that there are things that they can do. They have skills, they have talents, they have gifts. Creating environments that encourage attachment and belonging, especially if a child doesn't have that in their own home, but also thinking about our homes. How do we make our home a place where children belong? How do we make our communities places where children belong and have a role and are valued? How do we create nurturing community that embraces culture and spirituality in children? And it's interesting that this study, which has really no religious baseline, reflected on the value of spirituality in children as something that builds resilience and helps them in life. And that shows just the value of some of the things we do here through the Sunday school program, through our youth group program. And so all of this idea of looking at what's going on in children's lives, of considering adverse childhood experiences, it's not just a story of woe. It does explain a lot of the root causes that we see in the issues in our community, but it also calls us to do better as a community, to change that question from what's wrong with you to what happened to you, to look at how we can build resilience in the kids around us, and how we can do a better job of caring for the kids that are around us. We have a duty to safeguard children. We have a duty in our church communities, in our families, in our city to safeguard children. This is a duty that is not just a moral duty, it's that for sure, but it's also a God-given duty, as we saw from the scripture this morning. This is a duty that Jesus calls us to do. We cannot call ourselves Christians if we are not also safeguarding the children around us. So, while we are called to do all that we can to keep ACE scores low, to hold these growing up years as sacred, we are also called to give children the tools of care and resilience to help them find a place of belonging close to Jesus, so that their lives can be healthy, so that our communities can be healthy, so that the issues that we see in our city can be reduced, and so that as a whole, we live all better lives. And Jesus said, "Whoever welcomes one such child in my name welcomes me." When we do this, we welcome Jesus in our midst.